Hi, and welcome to The Horn, a podcast from International Crisis Group. I'm Alan Boswell. We haven't talked much on this podcast about Eritrea yet, in part because it's just so difficult to do so. So we're pleased to have Martin Plaut with us as our guest today. Martin is an author and journalist and currently a senior research fellow at the University of London. He's been covering Eritrea for almost 40 years. In this episode, we talk with Martin about President Isaias Afwerki's unyielding grip on power and regional ambitions, as well as Eritrea's uncertain future. Martin, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So we've talked a lot on this podcast about the big political shifts going on in the Horn of Africa region. We have the transitions in Sudan, Ethiopia, the shifting Red Sea dynamics. Amid this, President Isaias appears to be enjoying some newfound regional influence. Exactly how does Eritrea fit into this new regional picture, and is President Isaias proving able to shape some of these developments to his advantage, despite the many years of isolation?
Well, I think one of the things one must never underestimate about President Isaias is his ability to shape things. He has an extraordinary view of Eritrea, which is that it is the cornerstone of the whole of the Horn of Africa. In fact, he sees himself as a player within the whole of Africa. I mean, I don't know how many people remember, but he actually sent troops into the Democratic Republic of Congo and helped overthrow the previous government. So, I mean, he has an amazing view of himself. And he certainly sees himself as a major player. Even when there were United Nations sanctions on Eritrea, he had a huge impact on places like Somalia and then Ethiopia, being involved with Al-Shabaab and some of the Islamist groups in Eritrea and in Somalia. Really, I mean, he has had a huge influence throughout the period of his rule.
So, of course, one of the major recent developments in the region is the rise of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia. And soon after he came to power, you saw this Ethiopia-Eritrea peace deal, for which, of course, Prime Minister Abiy received the Nobel Prize. That was 2 years ago. What's happened since then?
Initially, it had a very dramatic impact because, of course, Prime Minister Abiy went to Eritrea, and the enthusiasm of the Eritrean people for his visit was astonishing. I mean, people came out in their tens of thousands, welcomed him. There was a huge optimism. The border was opened. The Prime Minister saw President Isaias. President Isaias even took him to see his grandchildren, which is something I don't think I've ever seen happen. So there was this huge feeling that things were on the up. But gradually, President Isaias began to see that there were real problems for him. For one thing, with the border open, people flooded out of the country. Something like 5,000 plus a day simply took the road into Ethiopia and thought, this is our one chance to leave, and they left. And President Isaias basically thought, this is terrible, I'm going to lose all my people. And he then locked down the border. The border is once again closed. And all these subsidiary negotiations that should have taken place about how to solve the border issue that goes back to the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea of 1998 to 2000, none of them took place. None of those discussions over what to do about the border took place. So, for example, there were some villages that were allocated to one side of the border that were actually on the other. Well, what do you do about that? If the border goes through a village, how do you share the land? All those questions need to be answered. And as far as we can see, none of those negotiations have actually taken place.
How much of the lack of progress is also due to the regional power of Tigray in Ethiopia and, of course, the elite there and their long-running dispute with President Isaias?
Well, you put your finger on the most critical issue, absolutely. The relationship between Eritrea and the Eritrean government and the Tigrayan people is long and complex. I mean, they've sometimes fought side by side with each other against the government in Ethiopia, and sometimes they've fought against each other. And I'm afraid there's some terrible historic precedents. I mean, I don't know how many people remember, but in 1984-85, in the Great Famine of Ethiopia, the Eritreans closed the border to Sudan and prevented emergency grain, from going from Sudan into Tigray. And the Tigrayans had to evacuate something like 100,000 people so that they didn't starve. Now, the Tigrayans have never forgotten that, as you can imagine. And that has been the huge problem, is that the governments literally loathe each other. And President Isaias is determined to try and end the rule of the Tigrayans in Tigray, the TPLF, which is the party that rules Tigray. And the Tigrayans, of course, see him in much the same terms.
President Isaias has used the unresolved border dispute with Ethiopia to keep Eritrea for a long time on a permanent quasi-war footing. There was a lot of speculation when the 2018 peace deal with Ethiopia and Eritrea was signed that this might weaken President Isaias's grip somehow on power. Does that look like that has happened at all?
No, I don't think so. I mean, one shouldn't forget that President Isaias is the Eritrean state. I mean, he literally rules the country with perhaps a couple of dozen people, and there's nobody else that has any say in power whatsoever. There are no opposition parties allowed, there are no free media, there's no judiciary, there's no constitution. So he does what he likes, and quite frankly, as long as you have the guns with yourself, you can do whatever you want. So there is no suggestion that President Isaias has in some way been weakened by what took place. And the fact that you have national service conscripts who are now mobilized permanently, ready for whatever's required, I mean, either for fighting another war if that was to take place, or for just use in the mines, on the roads, anything else. That hasn't really undermined him. Although people loathe going into it and flee the country, there's not much else they can do.
Do you think there's any prospect of that national service being unwound while President Isaias is in power? Has it become too instrumental to his continuing rule?
I think it's too instrumental to his rule. It is absolutely clear that he not only feels that it is the best way of running the country because nobody else has a say in what's going on, but it also is important in a sense culturally, because the one thing that he really loathed was after 1991, when his forces took the capital Asmara at the end of their 30-year war of independence against Ethiopia. The one thing that he absolutely loathed was the fact that the men and women who had been his troops in fighting that war, frankly, began to behave as if they were just civilians and no longer listened to him, began to challenge him. And, there was actually an attempt to force him to give them decent pay. His troops forced him to come to a stadium to listen to them. And he absolutely hated that. And I think that in a sense, keeping people within a system that is so repressive just fits his kind of personality. And, it serves his regime's purpose, but also serves his personally.
You mentioned, to never underestimate his ability to shape matters. When you look at what's happening in the region with the transitions in Sudan and Ethiopia, where do you see his hand?
Well, I think that he will do whatever he can in order to strengthen his own position and to maintain his grip on the region such as it is. So, for example, if you take Djibouti, there is an ongoing border dispute that has not been resolved, despite endless attempts to do so. Relations with Sudan go up and down. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're very bad. Sometimes he has links with the opposition, sometimes he links with the government in Khartoum. And, all of these are a juggling act and he sees himself as someone who can play whatever forces there are in the region. You only have to look at what he did in the situation in Yemen to see how he plays this. Yeah. So once he had good relations with Iran, those were dropped when he felt he had a better deal with the UAE and the Saudis. And I think he probably got a lot of money in return. I don't mean personally, but I mean as a government.
It is quite remarkable when you think of Eritrea's position and you look at the changes, in its two big neighbors, Sudan and Ethiopia, and then, like you mentioned, the war in Yemen. right across the strait, and really it's all the region around it going through massive shifts. How has the war in Yemen, you touched on it there, but how has the war in Yemen really changed Eritrea's sort of strategic significance?
Well, it has meant that the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis both see Eritrea as central to their war effort. The UAE has a base in one of the ports of Asab, and the Saudis use it as well. And they also fly jets from there both to attack the Houthi rebels in Yemen, but they also use it as a supply line to their links in Libya, where they are also operational. So it becomes a regional power base, and also a place, the port of Asab is used by the UAE allegedly for torturing and extracting confessions from Houthi rebels who are captured by them. So it's a very useful place. Nobody can go and visit it. It's entirely off the radar, and what's not to like from it if you're a ruler of the UAE or Saudi Arabia?
I read a 2002 interview in which President Isaias gave, and he predicted Eritrea would prove more and more strategic to outside partners because Ethiopia would weaken internally as the Oromo demanded more power, and he also predicted the political crisis in Yemen would sort of threaten the political order. Those predictions coming from 2002 in some ways seem quite remarkable. Sometimes we hear from interlocutors talk of President Isaias almost having a master plan and, very much behind the scenes. Shaping events, as you've mentioned. How much do you think he's just been the recipient of these new twists and fortune for him, and how much do you think he has been involved in actually shaping the region that he sits within?
In a sense, I think it's both of those things. In one sense, he is a past master at seeing weakness and finding a loophole in which he can operate. So, he had no qualms about working with Islamists like Al-Shabaab when it suited him. He dropped them like a hot brick when it didn't suit him any longer. He's in no way an Islamist. That's certainly not his ideology. He has no love for them whatsoever, and has crushed the Islamist groups inside his own country. So he's utterly ruthless and is capable of doing anything that he sees fit. And, there aren't many people who are quite as tough as that, even in a region like the Horn of Africa. As a result, he has been able to, basically shape things in the way that he wants to. At the same time, people see him as a useful partner. So, for example, both the European Union and the United States, which have interests in the region, are really not keen to see anything that would topple President Isaias, because, who knows what you get if you get rid of him? Might be something worse. And I think that is the sort of attitude that most of the outside international powers have about him. They don't like him, but who might come next?
Yeah, and I want us to discuss the European approach to President Isaias and Eritrea here a bit later. How would you describe President Isaias' strategy right now towards the new government in Addis Ababa?
Well, I suppose, if I was going to be honest, I think that he sees them as useful. He's prepared to tolerate them. After all, they are not Tigrayan. They have led to a weakening of what was for many years his major opponent, both in terms of the Tigrayans and in terms of Ethiopia as a whole. Many years ago, he predicted that without his support, the Ethiopian government would collapse. At the time, I certainly thought it was a crazy prediction. But it, as you pointed out, this has proved truer than one might have expected. How this develops over a period of time, of course, is impossible to know. But he has been very, very shrewd in what he does. And this ability to twist events to his ends has been extremely effective.
Now, Eritrea still refuses to participate in IGAD. Do you think President Isaias has a vision for a different sort of regional order, and what does that look like?
I think the regional order that he'd like to see is one which takes his view of Eritrea as being a linchpin of the region seriously. And, he doesn't really like the idea of having to share power with others in the region. Yes, he will work with them. There's no doubt about that. But, why share power? And, he's never seen any point in getting assistance from anybody else from the outside. He got rid of, quite frankly, almost all of the aid agencies that were operational in Eritrea at independence. He either ignored them or finally just told them to leave. And anyone else who's tried to work with him finds the same. So, unless it's on his terms and on his terms only, there's no reason why he should cooperate with anyone. Having said that, there is one major development on which he does require cooperation, and that is a potash mine in the Danakil, which is massive, absolutely huge. And that requires cross-border cooperation with Ethiopia. And I think it is one of the drivers of the deal with the Ethiopians, such as it is.
Eritrea, for a long time sort of sponsored insurgent groups around the region, as you mentioned, often Ethiopian opposition groups, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Does that sort of behavior continue?
I have absolutely no information that it is continuing. I think that he ended it. He saw it as being too dangerous and too expensive in terms of international support and international opprobrium. After all, when he basically mended his ways and cut those ties with the Somali Islamist groups, it finally led to the lifting of UN sanctions and better relations with some of the international powers. And so I suppose there's no reason why continue a strategy if it's served its purposes. And I have no information that he is doing it at the moment.
So I want us to turn to talking about the Eritrean regime, because it is truly unique, and I think it always bears repeating just how unique it is. Some have described it closer to a mafia state than a nation state. How does President Isaias stay in power?
I think it's in a complex way. On the one hand, he is extremely repressive and is prepared to put anyone, even the people he has worked with for 20, 30 years and more, in jail without trial indefinitely. And so he is really ruthless in what he does. The people of Eritrea, I don't know how much you know, but for example, when you do your final year of schooling, you have to do it in the military academy in Sawa, which is a very repressive place, very tough place to go into. And you have to go, and that's the beginning of your military conscription. And you then go through that and can be in military service for 20 years or more. It is indefinite. So, you're trapped in that system. There are also two systems which were invented during the Eritrean fight for liberation from the Ethiopians, one of which is designed to spread rumors against people that he does not approve of, and the other one is to spy on anyone who basically he has any concerns about. So going right down to the village level, even into families, there are people who are required to provide information to the center, to spy on their friends, their family, anybody else in their neighborhood. And it's very much like the East German situation, where there was almost nobody whom you could trust. And so you get this feeling in Eritrea of absolute uncertainty. People are worried. They're constantly looking over their shoulder, wondering, who can I trust? Who can I work with? And the answer is, you can't work with anybody because the Eritrean government will crush you. So if you compare it, say, with neighboring Sudan, in Sudan you had all these professional organizations which were critical to the eventual overthrow of the previous regime. In Eritrea, there is nothing that looks even vaguely like that. There is no independent organization whatsoever. The only organizations which exist are those that are controlled by the state.
And Eritrea has been put under such heavy sanctions by the UN and others. How does he manage to keep a budget?
Well, actually, the sanctions were not that tough. They were against military and they were against named individuals. There was not a general economic sanctions as they were in other instances, in other situations. So he could have kept going. But the other thing is that he has, it may sound appalling to say this, but he has little concern about the fact that people are poor. In Asmara, the capital, there are almost daily cuts of power, there's little running water, there are shortages of all sorts of things. Doesn't concern him whatsoever. As long as people are being disciplined and controlled, that is enough. And the country really runs on a mixture of three things, one of which is peasant agriculture. About 80% of people live in the villages and run little farms, which they survive on. The second is mining. There is some mining, and that provides some income. And the third is the diaspora. Foreign Eritreans put a lot of money into the country because they need to support their families, because their families are so poor. And as long as the money keeps flowing in, well, the president has his cash.
What is life like for the Eritrean diaspora under the shadow of this regime? In your book, you go through you describe in detail sort of the long arm reach of this Asmara regime, even to, the hundreds of thousands who have fled.
Well, it exists in a sense in exactly the same way as it does inside the country. There are people who will spy on you, there are people who will report on you, and they will spread rumors about you. Oh, he's not a very good person. Isn't he having an affair with somebody? These kind of things. If they don't like you, they'll find all sorts of things they can say about you. You were never a real true patriot. Those kind of things are spread. The other thing is that they infiltrate people into foreign government services. So we have information recently that in the Netherlands, translators who are dealing with refugees who are applying for asylum, the translators are actually reporting back to the regime and are not even translating accurately and telling people if they make any criticisms of the Eritrean government, don't think you should really be saying that. So they have all sorts of ways of working in the diaspora. They also extract money from the diaspora. There's a 2% tax. If you arrive in, shall we say, Denmark, and you live there for 5-6 years, you begin to build up a bit of a life for yourself, you were a student, then you may have a business, and you then want to send, shall we say, some clothes back to your family, or you want to sell a family home in Eritrea, the Eritrean embassy will say to you, well, before you do that, have you paid your 2% tax? And they don't mean the 2% tax on your current earnings, they mean the 2% tax on every penny, including student grants, from the moment you arrived in Denmark. You have to pay that, and when you have a certificate, then you are allowed to send the money or the clothes or whatever it is to Eritrea. Without it, you have no relationship with the country any longer. It's really repressive.
And he's able to continue doing that even though it's been officially banned legally in many places or by the United Nations.
No, you're absolutely right. It was. Unfortunately, it was one of the sanctions that was lifted when sanctions against Eritrea for their relations with Al-Shabaab and the Islamists was lifted. That was lifted too. But it is outlawed in some countries. The Canadians, for example, have been very strong on this and not allowed it. They, in fact, expelled the ambassador when he continued to push it. But most countries, quite frankly, Eritrea is a small country, 3-4 million, maybe 5 million people. Nobody knows. There's never been a census in recent times. They just say, what the heck, it's not worth worrying about.
And life is so difficult in Eritrea that hundreds of thousands have, tried to flee to other countries as refugees. Many of them to Europe, and President Isaias has also managed to have this play to his advantage as well.
Well, indeed it does. It certainly plays to his advantage because It means that there are more people in the diaspora. It is like a safety valve. All the young kids who really are fed up with living under that kind of rule flee to Ethiopia, Sudan, who still have huge refugee camps with Eritreans in them. And then if they have the get up and go, and it requires huge courage, you find a people smuggler. He takes you through the Sahara Desert and eventually possibly to Libya. But the links between Libya and across the Mediterranean have become increasingly difficult. Since 2015, the European Union has effectively built what is an effective wall across the Mediterranean. I don't mean a literal wall, but a sort of legal wall across the Mediterranean. And in a lot of countries, Switzerland, for example, now puts people on the plane, even if they've got that far, puts them on the plane back to Eritrea. So it's a really, really tough situation.
And, Europe looks at Eritrea and they see a country that sits on the Red Sea, which is strategically very vital for them. They also see all these refugees coming from Eritrea, and yet they see President Isaias, who rules over, has one of the worst human rights records of any leader in the world. So how have they tried to deal with that?
Well, they've done two things. The first is that they have tried to assist Eritrea by providing them with development funds in the hopes that Eritrea becomes more prosperous and people have a better life and therefore they don't flee. And the second thing that they have done is that they have, through what's known as the Khartoum process, they have set up a series of links which provide information. It's information sharing, information gathering through Interpol with the Eritrean government. As one of the many recipients of this information, there's a regional operations center in Khartoum, which has European personnel in it who have been gathering and supplying this information. So they've been doing everything that they possibly can to end the number of refugees who cross the Mediterranean. Mustn't forget, in 2015, there were 1 million people who arrived on Europe's shores. And there was such pressure on the European Union governments that they basically said, whatever it takes, we're going to stop it. So Eritrea now is an honored partner in this relationship. They, in fact, were chairing the whole relationship between the European Union and Africa a couple of years ago. And they see him as an equal partner in getting anything they can.
Are there any signs that this political engagement is producing any fruits?
Well, not really, because the Eritreans basically, to put it bluntly, don't give a damn. You can offer them anything you like, but their basic attitude is, we do it on our own. So you can offer them huge amounts of money, you can offer them assistance. And they say, yeah, fine. You want to give it to us, but it's on our terms. So there's been no shaping of the regime. There's been no lessening of the repression. The many, many recommendations which were made by the UN Human Rights Commission after lengthy reports, I can't think of any that have been implemented.
Are we any closer to seeing any signs of a light at the end of the tunnel, if you will, of Isaias's rule? For instance, how is his health? What is the status of internal opposition? Or is it very difficult to tell the answer to any of those questions?
It's very difficult. He had cerebral malaria some years ago, but he seems to have recovered from it. I know of no indication that he's anything but well and healthy. He used to drink a lot, I was told, but I think that's been moderated in recent years. So I don't think that, apart from the normal aging, that he has any real problems on that front. As for internal opposition, some people have taken, not to the streets really in recent years, but they have put up posters, they have put up slogans criticizing the government. But, you've got to be exceptionally brave to do it because, there's such a system of spies and network of informers that who can you trust? It's really, really difficult. So, there's no indication that the government is about to fall. Having said that, the one thing you can be sure about with repressive regimes like this is that you can't see the change coming until it hits you.
And as you've talked about repeatedly thus far, this is a country really just remarkably wrapped up around one figure. What might a post-Isaias Eritrea look like?
I must be honest with you, I haven't the faintest idea. The only thing that you can look at and is to say that there are some positive elements. The one is that there is no religious hostility between the Christian and the Muslim communities. They've always got on pretty well. There has been tension. There was tension in the 1960s, 70s. But since then, they've had good relations. And there's a real attempt by the diaspora to make sure that continues, that people link up. There are also, in recent years, in the diaspora, there's been a really substantial movement which has gathered force called Yakul, which is bringing people together across generations and across nations. And they're trying to make a difference and really unite the opposition such as it is. But I'm afraid the opposition is very fragmented. There are, 20, 30 different opposition parties. Again, they are trying to unite, but there's little sign of progress. And although they might achieve some unity, what would they do then? And there is, in a sense, a split in the Eritrean opposition between two views. One says, we've had enough, we should fight. And the other one says, no, we've fought long enough, we can't kill each other. And that has been a really difficult one. There's also a Christian-Muslim split that existed within the opposition, but I do think that is being overcome. So in a sense, if I was to be hopeful about Eritrea, I would say that it is the church and the mosque that will in the end try to pull people together and hold the ring when a new government finally takes shape.
I think that's a good note to end on. So thanks, Martin, for coming on the podcast and for your time.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Horn. If you want to find out more about Crisis Group, visit our website at crisisgroup.org or follow us on Twitter at Crisis Group. Crisis Group has also launched a new weekly podcast, Hold Your Fire, that dives each week into a conflict around the globe. And of course, we also have a sister podcast, War and Peace, focused on Europe. I'm Alan Boswell. Join us in 2 weeks for our next episode. The Horn is produced by Maeve Francis.